In 1943, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania produced more steel than the entire nation of Germany. Let that sink in for a moment. One American city, one river valley in western Pennsylvania, outproducing an entire industrialized nation that had been building its war machine for over a decade. The furnaces of Pittsburgh burned so bright and so hot that pilots flying over the city at night used the glow as a navigation landmark. The smoke was so thick that streetlights came on automatically at noon because the sky was too dark for daylight to break through. Men who worked those mills came home so covered in soot that their wives could not recognize them until they washed their faces. It was brutal, it was dangerous, it was magnificent, and it built the modern world. The bridges, the skyscrapers, the railroads, the ships, the weapons that won 2 world wars. They were all made possible by what happened in Pittsburgh. Then in the 1980s, it all collapsed. In less than a decade, Pittsburgh lost more than 150,000 manufacturing jobs. Entire mill towns along the Monongahela River became ghost towns almost overnight. Families that had built their entire identity around the steel industry watched everything they had ever known simply disappear. What happened to Pittsburgh steel is one of the most dramatic economic collapses in American history, and the forces that destroyed it are still reshaping America today. Before we continue, less than 5% of viewers are subscribed. If you believe in history hidden secrets, hit that subscribe button right now. To understand what Pittsburgh became, you have to start with geography. 3 rivers come together here, the Allegheny flowing from the northeast, the Monongahela flowing from the southeast, and where they meet, the Ohio River begins its journey west. The Native Americans who lived here for thousands of years understood the strategic importance of this junction. The French understood it. The British understood it. And when a young Virginia militia officer named George Washington came here in 1753 to survey the territory, he understood it immediately. The French had already built Fort Duquesne at the point where the rivers met. Washington recommended that the British build a fort here. The resulting conflict became the French and Indian War, the first genuinely global conflict in human history. Pittsburgh, before it was even Pittsburgh, was already at the center of world events. The British eventually won. They built Fort Pitt at the confluence, and a city began to grow around it. For decades, Pittsburgh was primarily a gateway, a launching point for settlers heading west. Flatboats were built here and floated down the Ohio River carrying families and supplies into the frontier. The city had glassmakers and craftsmen and merchants, but nothing that suggested the extraordinary industrial destiny that was coming. Then someone noticed the mountains. The hills surrounding Pittsburgh were filled with coal. Not just ordinary coal, but coking coal, the specific type needed to fuel iron furnaces at the temperatures required to make steel. And the rivers that defined Pittsburgh's geography were perfect for bringing iron ore down from the Great Lakes. The combination was almost too perfect. Coal and ore and water transportation, and a city already established as a commercial hub. The ingredients for the greatest steel-making operation in human history were all right here, waiting to be assembled. The person who assembled them most effectively was a Scottish immigrant named Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie had come to America as a child with almost nothing. His family settled in Pittsburgh. He began working at 13. Telegraph operator, railroad man, investor, builder. Carnegie had a genius for understanding systems, for seeing how pieces connected, for recognizing opportunity before others did. In 1872, Carnegie visited England and observed the Bessemer steel-making process. It was a revolutionary method that could convert iron into steel faster and cheaper than anything previously possible. Carnegie immediately understood what this meant. He came home to Pittsburgh and built a Bessemer steel plant. The timing was extraordinary. America was in the middle of an infrastructure explosion. Railroads were spreading across the continent. Cities were growing vertically, demanding structural steel for new buildings. Bridges were being constructed across every major river. The demand for steel was essentially unlimited, and Carnegie could produce it cheaper and faster than anyone else on Earth. He was ruthless about efficiency, constantly improving processes, constantly driving down costs, constantly expanding capacity. If a new technology made his existing equipment obsolete, he tore out the old equipment and installed the new. His competitors could not keep up. By the 1890s, Carnegie Steel was the largest and most profitable steel company in the world. The mills stretched for miles along the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers. Towns like Homestead and Braddock and Duquesne and McKeesport existed for one purpose: to make steel for Carnegie. The workers who filled those mills came from everywhere, from Ireland and Wales, from Poland and Slovakia and Hungary and Italy, from the American South. Each new wave of immigration brought fresh labor into the furnaces and rolling mills. Pittsburgh became one of the most ethnically diverse cities in America, its neighborhoods organized by country of origin, each with its own churches and clubs and traditions. The work was unimaginably hard. 12-hour shifts in temperatures that regularly exceeded 150 degrees near the furnaces. Molten steel that could kill instantly. Falls, burns, crushing accidents. The mills were extraordinarily dangerous places, and the death toll was constant and terrible. In 1892, Carnegie Steel's Homestead Mill became the site of one of the most dramatic labor conflicts in American history. Workers had organized and were fighting for better wages and conditions. Carnegie, who publicly claimed to support workers' rights, left the country on vacation and turned the situation over to his partner, Henry Clay Frick. Frick hired 300 Pinkerton detectives and loaded them onto barges to assault the locked-out workers. The workers were waiting for them. The Battle of Homestead lasted all day. Workers fired on the Pinkerton barges. The Pinkertons returned fire. By the time the shooting stopped, 7 workers and 3 Pinkertons were dead. Dozens were wounded. The governor sent in 8,000 National Guard troops to end the standoff. The Union was broken. The workers went back to the mills on Carnegie's terms, but the memory of Homestead burned in the consciousness of the American labor movement for generations. Carnegie sold his steel company to J.P. Morgan in 1901 for $480 million. Morgan merged it with other steel companies to create United States Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in American history. The headquarters was in Pittsburgh. The mills were in Pittsburgh. The power was in Pittsburgh. The city that the steel industry built was genuinely extraordinary. The wealth generated by steel-financed institutions that would have been remarkable in any city in the world. Carnegie himself, driven perhaps by guilt over Homestead, gave away virtually his entire fortune before he died. He funded over 2,500 libraries worldwide. He built Carnegie Hall in New York. He established Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. He created foundations that still operate today. The city built museums, concert halls, universities, and parks. The Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra became world famous. The Carnegie Museum of Natural History housed dinosaur fossils discovered specifically because Carnegie funded the expeditions. Pittsburgh was not just an industrial city, it was a cultural capital, a place where the wealth of industry paid for genuine civilization. By 1910, Pittsburgh's population had reached over 500,000. The broader metropolitan area, including all the mill towns along the rivers, held well over 1 million people. Families lived in tight-knit communities built around the mills. The rhythm of life was set by the shift whistles, 3 shifts, around the clock. The furnaces never went out. World War I brought extraordinary demand. Pittsburgh Steel built the weapons and the ships that helped end the war. The mills ran day and night. Wages rose. The workforce expanded. The 1920s brought prosperity and continued growth. The 1930s brought the Great Depression and suffering. But even through the Depression, Pittsburgh's mills never fully stopped. Steel was too essential to American infrastructure to disappear entirely. Then World War II arrived, and Pittsburgh entered its greatest moment. The demand was staggering and immediate. Every ship, every tank, every artillery piece, every aircraft required steel. The federal government needed Pittsburgh to produce at levels never previously attempted, and Pittsburgh delivered. The mills operated beyond their designed capacity. Workers took double shifts. New workers were recruited from across the country. The glow of Pittsburgh's furnaces became a symbol of American industrial power and determination. Producing more steel than Nazi Germany's entire industry. That was not just an economic achievement. It was a military one. It was a moral one. The steel of Pittsburgh helped save the world from fascism. The years after World War II were Pittsburgh's golden age, mills humming, workers earning wages that made genuine middle-class life possible. Neighborhoods thriving. The Pittsburgh Steelers, named explicitly for the industry that defined the city, were becoming one of the great dynasties in professional football. But trouble was already forming beneath the surface. The American steel industry had emerged from World War II as the dominant force in global steel production, almost by default. European and Japanese steel industries had been destroyed by the war. American companies faced essentially no international competition for nearly 2 decades after 1945. That lack of competition made them complacent. They did not invest sufficiently in new technology. While Japanese and German steel industries rebuilt from scratch using the most modern processes available, American companies continued operating facilities that were increasingly outdated. They were profitable enough. There was no urgent pressure to modernize. By the 1960s, imported steel was beginning to appear in the American market. Japanese steel in particular was often better quality and lower cost than American steel. The industry lobbied for tariff protection. They got some, but they did not use the protection to modernize aggressively. The 1973 oil shock hit steel hard. Steel production is enormously energy-intensive. When energy costs quadrupled almost overnight, the economics of American steel making shifted dramatically, and then came the combination of factors that produced the collapse. The American economy was changing structurally. The great infrastructure build-out that had required millions of tons of steel annually was largely complete. Interstate highways were built. Skyscrapers were standing. The military build-up that had sustained demand for decades was moderating. At the same time, competition intensified. South Korea built a modern steel industry almost from nothing in the 1970s. Their labor costs were far lower. Their facilities were far newer. Their government actively supported their steel industry with subsidies and favorable policies. American steel companies faced the brutal arithmetic of an industry where their cost structure was no longer competitive. They had old equipment. They had labor agreements negotiated during the profitable years that locked in wage and benefit levels that their foreign competitors did not match. The collapse, when it came, was devastatingly fast. Between 1979 and 1987, the Pittsburgh area lost more than 150,000 manufacturing jobs. Mills that had operated for nearly a century simply closed. Not downsized. Closed. Permanently. The Homestead Works, site of the famous 1892 battle, closed in 1986. Dorothy 6, one of the last great blast furnaces at the Duquesne Works, was shut down. Milltown after milltown along the Monongahela experienced the same catastrophic sequence. The mill closes. The workers lose their jobs. The local stores lose their customers. The tax base collapses. The schools deteriorate. The young people leave. The human devastation was immense. Men who had worked 30 years in the mills found themselves unemployed at 50 years old with skills that the new economy did not want. Their identities were built around their work. Their communities were built around their mills. When the mills closed, both the work and the community disappeared simultaneously. Suicide rates climbed. Alcoholism surged. Domestic violence increased. Families broke apart under the pressure of unemployment and hopelessness. The towns along the Mon Valley became zones of concentrated despair. Pittsburgh's population, which had reached over 676,000 in 1950, fell below 300,000 by 2010. The broader region lost hundreds of thousands more. Entire communities that had existed for the sole purpose of making steel simply emptied out. But Pittsburgh itself did something that most people did not expect. It survived, and then it began to transform. The same universities that Carnegie's money had built became the engines of a different kind of economy. Carnegie Mellon University became one of the world's leading institutions for computer science and robotics research. The University of Pittsburgh's medical center became one of the largest employers in the region. UPMC, as it became known, grew into a healthcare empire that now employs over 90,000 people. Technology companies began arriving. Google established a significant presence in Pittsburgh. Uber chose Pittsburgh as the testing ground for its autonomous vehicle research because of the city's access to Carnegie Mellon engineering talent. Robotics companies, artificial intelligence firms, and medical technology businesses built operations here. The Pittsburgh that emerged from the wreckage of the steel industry is genuinely different from the city that existed before. Cleaner air. The rivers that were once industrial sewers are now used for kayaking and recreation. The skies that were perpetually dark are now open. The city has won national recognition for its quality of life, for its neighborhoods, for its art scene, for its universities. But here is the complicated truth. The Pittsburgh that reinvented itself is not the Pittsburgh that was destroyed. The technology and healthcare economy that replaced steel employs different people with different skills and different backgrounds. The steel workers and their children and grandchildren who filled those mill towns along the Monongahela largely did not benefit from Pittsburgh's reinvention. Many of them left. The ones who stayed often found themselves in a transformed city that had moved on without them. The mill towns themselves, places like Braddock and McKeesport and Clairton, did not share in Pittsburgh's recovery. They remained depressed, depopulated, and struggling. Braddock, once a thriving steel community, had fewer than 2,000 residents by 2020. The Carnegie Library that Carnegie himself built in Braddock still stands, a monument to a man who made his fortune in this town and then moved on. There is a lesson in that library, in the fact that the same man who built it also employed the Pinkerton detectives who shot the workers of Homestead. Greatness and exploitation often travel together. Industry and injustice often occupy the same space. Pittsburgh steel built the modern world. The Brooklyn Bridge, the Empire State Building, the ships that carried troops to Normandy. The framework of 20th century American civilization was made from Pittsburgh steel by Pittsburgh workers, at enormous cost to their health and safety, and sometimes their lives. Those workers deserved better than what they received when the industry collapsed. Their communities deserved better. The promises that were made to them, implicitly through decades of labor, were not kept. That is the real rise and fall of Pittsburgh steel, not just the economic story of an industry that dominated and then declined, but the human story of people who gave everything to build something extraordinary, and then watched it disappear, and were left to find their own way through the wreckage. The furnaces are cold now. The mills are mostly gone. Some have been converted to other uses. The waterfront shopping complex sits on what was once the Homestead Works, the site of that bloody 1892 battle. The irony of a shopping mall replacing a Union battlefield is not lost on anyone paying attention. The Monongahela River still flows past the ruins of the great mills. The three rivers still meet at the point where George Washington stood and understood that this place would matter. Pittsburgh is still here, changed, smaller, smarter, some say. But somewhere in the hills above those rivers, in the neighborhoods where steelworker families built their lives and raised their children and went to church and grew old, there is a memory of what this place was, what it meant, what was lost when the furnaces went dark. That memory deserves to be honored. Those workers deserve to be remembered. The story of Pittsburgh steel is not just industrial history. It is American history. The story of what this country can build when it commits fully to something, and the story of what it leaves behind when it moves on.